Alex, and thank you everybody for being here. We're not in our usual space this evening, but we're going to make do. And it's fantastic to have you all coming along for what I think is a really interesting and somewhat strange evening session tonight. I say strange because it may seem quite amazing to us that for more than a century, the intellectual and spiritual life in the world's superpower, Byzantium, for the time that we're talking about, was dominated by the question of whether or not icons, like this one of St. Peter, were a good thing. Whether or not depictions of holy figures had any place in Christian worship. And it really seems in a way like a simple question. Do we want icons? Yes or no? However, the way that this question worked out, it created an entirely new and unexpected worldview. In fact, it created several of them with very profound implications for theology, for anthropology, for the arts, as well as for politics, and of course, for everyday life and worship for average Christians. So, what is this question of icons? Well, the question of depicting holy figures or not depicting them was not something new, nor was it an exclusively Christian matter. In the book of Exodus, when Moses was on Mount Sinai, you can see him at the top part of the picture with Mount Sinai in the middle, himself receiving the tablets of God's law, the distillation of the divine commandments into 10 precepts that literally were written on stone. And while he was receiving this revelation on the top of the mountain, God told Moses, oh, by the way, while you're up here, down below the people are making an idol to worship because they really are uncomfortable having a God who is too big to see. Now, perhaps Moses found that a little hard to believe, but when he went down the mountain, he saw that it was true, that the people had persuaded his brother Aaron to make a gold statue of a calf, and people were happily worshiping it, calling it God. They knew it, they knew it's not God himself, but they were happy to have something in front of themselves that they felt that they could relate to. They had reduced God to a figurine. And Moses was so upset when he saw that this was actually happening that he broke the stone tablets with the law. The first of those laws was, you shall not make yourself any graven image to worship it. And then he went back up the mountain, did the laws again, but he also made the people grind up the calf statue into powder, and he put it in their drinking water. God, this story clearly said, does not need depiction, nor does he want to be depicted. In fact, he forbids it. The same principle, anti-image kind of stance, is observed in Islam, which arguably took the idea even farther than Judaism did. What you see here in the picture is a Persian manuscript illumination of Ibrahim, destroying the idols in his hometown. This story is not in the Bible, in case it's not sounding familiar to you, but it is found in Christian Apocrypha, and it is also found in the Quran in Surah 26. And because Islam chose not to use depictions of human figures that might be taken to worship, Islam developed geometrical decoration to an extraordinarily high peak of artistic perfection. in addition to their focus on geometrical shapes. Muslims also incorporated letters into their art and architecture as well, elevating the significance of written words to a kind of a mystical art. This is the Tuhra of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The Islamic prescription against depicting living beings grew over time, and it deepened, became broader. And even in very recent years, a conservative Islamic aversion to images of all kinds has overridden their respect for culture and for other faiths. In 2001, the Taliban destroyed massive statues of the Buddha in Afghanistan, world cultural treasures. And just this year, we have seen the defacement of things like the imaginative face on this decorative angel on Razan-Chetsot's cathedral in Shushi. The defacing of images is taken as a good deed. Images should not be made. This instance of defacement, however, that you see in the picture, was not the product of Islamic or Jewish anti-image sentiment. This comes from 16th century Belgium. There too, elements of the local Christian population, in the middle of a hot debate over the appropriateness of such images in churches, obliterated their faces as a way of showing those who they felt over-venerated these images that the images are just lifeless things that had no power to protect themselves, let alone anyone who might pray before them. And the matter of images became a distinguishing feature that made Roman Catholic worship, often in a highly decorated and imaged space, distinctly different from Protestant worship, which avoided images of all kinds. Both of these churches, just for the record, are in Czechoslovakia. In other words, the Byzantine debate, and sometimes outright bloodshed, over icons was actually part of a time-honored ancient concern with a long pedigree and many different solutions. That being said, however, the debate over holy images in the 8th to 9th centuries in the Byzantine world had a particular flavor, unlike that in Europe, because of the unique elements that fed into it. And we're going to talk about two of these elements, one religious or philosophical from the world of faith and ideas, and the other factor economic and political. There's also another little trigger issue as well that we need to factor in when we think about the icon debate in a Byzantine setting. It's very interesting to remember that over the period from the early 8th to the mid-9th century, when icons are a hot button topic, the Byzantine imperial world shrank significantly. What you see here in purple are the Byzantine-controlled territories. These shrank considerably from what had been Byzantine prior to the arrival of Islam in the area. By conquering the lands between Byzantium and Persia, as well as the north coast of Africa, Islam had been a strong factor in the decline of Byzantine power. Not just the decline of Byzantine power, but also of the economy that came with that power. In other words, we have to contextualize the question of icons within Byzantine soul searching over what they had lost. And not just what they had lost, but how they had lost it, to whom they had lost it. And why had their loss been so catastrophically large? Okay, so within this context of why has this happened to us, we can begin to look at the faith-related / philosophical / ideological elements of the icons issue. As we said last time, in 692, the fifth and sixth council, the Quinisext council, or the council in Trullo, the same one that made those anti-Armenian canons, ordained that Christ was to be realistically portrayed. So the council was actually sanctioning something that was already being done, because this image of the incarnate Christ was made in the 6th century, 100 years before the council met. At the same time, much Byzantine thought was being devoted to other things as icons of Christ, because the term icon in Greek applies to depictions in word as well as in paint or other forms. And Byzantine theologians were thinking very carefully about the power of the Eucharist as an icon of Christ's sacrifice. So this helps to make sense of a canon from the Council in Trullo that we did not look at last time, but that deals with something that sounds really, really odd to our ears. Canon 57 of the Council says, "It is not right to offer milk and honey on the altar." And we look at that canon and go, what? Who in the world was doing that? Who ever heard of such a thing? Is this some kind of bizarre practice in some heretical sect someplace that the council is opposing? It also opposes offering grapes at the altar, but that's a different question. And we look at that and we think, what in the world are they talking about? But it may not be quite as weird as it sounds to our ears, because even though we have not heard of such a custom, there is a document, probably from the 4th century, called the Tradition of the Apostles. It's attributed to a 3rd century father, Hippolytus of Rome, although it probably is not his. This document describes specifically how the Eucharist that comes immediately after baptism is supposed to take place. And look at what it says. It says, "Then the deacons shall immediately bring the oblation," that is, the gifts that are going to be offered. "The bishop shall bless the bread and the bowl of mixed wine." So far, we're on board with this. "And the milk and honey mixed together, in fulfillment of the promise made to the fathers, in which God said, 'A land flowing with milk and honey,' which Christ indeed gave, his flesh, through which those who believe are nourished like little children by the sweetness of his word, so that the inner person, by ingesting, may also receive the same as the body has received in baptism, in other words. The bishop shall give an explanation of all these things to those who are receiving in the context of having just been baptized." Well, that's interesting. For someone who's newly baptized, The first communion does have bread and wine, but it also has milk and honey as a symbol of the sweetness of the learning and the life on which the newly baptized person is entering. I don't know about you, but to me, it sounds like this could have been a very meaningful experience for a newly baptized person who had just spent the preceding 40 days or so of Lent learning the basics of the faith, hearing the imagery of the promised land, understanding the metaphorical journey through the wilderness that life is for all of us in the same way that it was for the people of Israel. So what, in the eyes of that late 7th century council, was wrong with keeping that? Why should it not be done? Well, the explanation is a little bit complex. The Byzantine Church had been pondering deeply, and all of these different issues, icons, milk and honey, and so on, are part of this bigger pondering. They had been pondering deeply the idea of reality with a capital R. What is that? Is the reality with a small r that we physically experience the same as the reality with a capital R, or is it not? Is there more to life, in other words, than our personal day-to-day experience? If there is more to reality than what meets the eye and the senses, then how does what is beyond, in the reality with a capital R, relate to the life, the reality that we sense and know? And these theologians came to the consensus that reality with a capital R is eternal. In other words, it is outside time. It is outside the flow of seconds and minutes and hours and days and months and years in which we humans normally find ourselves enmeshed. As time-bound creatures, we experience ourselves and we experience our life as limited by time, as forced into a kind of march from one thing to another, a one-way street from one thing to another. And by contrast to that, the reality with a capital R that is beyond this small reality of minutes and days does not experience that kind of limitation. Reality with a capital R is always there. Being beyond the ticking of our clock can be within each second equally, because it is not limited by seconds. The great kind of presence that we all feel from time to time is actually, these fathers said, always there. And its meaning is present in ways that we cannot understand necessarily, but we can feel it with our inner senses. And in a way, by acknowledging that divine reality with a capital R, we invite ourselves to become more conscious of it more often, in more moments, in more settings. Thus, by using the same physical objects, in the case of the Eucharist, that's bread and wine, that Christ used at the Last Supper with his disciples, we tap into the capital R reality of what he was doing with his disciples in our small r reality. In the eating of bread and the drinking of wine, Jesus showed his disciples a great mystery. He showed them that even though it was incredibly important that he saved humanity from the stark conditions of sin, that is, from the harm that is done to us and the harm that we do, intentionally or not, and the ultimate harm that comes to us all by death, he did more. He also became part of his followers. He became their literal food. Jesus partook with them in their life, their small r reality, so that they could partake in his capital R reality. And so now, as limbs of Christ's body, to use that metaphor, we incorporate and we share his body and blood. They become part of us because he is really, with a capital R, in them. And this idea that the fathers derived, this idea that the physical objects of bread and wine are simultaneously the reality of Christ himself, of his body and blood, resonated with people, and it became very, very important to Byzantine Christianity, and not just to Byzantines, obviously. So the Eucharist is an icon of Christ. Painted depictions are icons of Christ. There are also other material objects that were part of that reality with a capital R, and that became touching points between that reality and reality with a small r. Relics, for example, were material objects that could contain and spread divine grace and power. In other words, they could give contact with the capital R reality through physical contact in the small r reality. Relics were more than just a reminder of the holiness of the person to whose body they had once belonged. Relics shared the capital R reality that those saints had experienced, and they could share it with other people in proximity to them, either physically or through prayer. And this was true, the fathers felt, whether we remember well to whom they belonged, as we remember very well this famous relic of the right arm of St. Gregory the Illuminator. There is no mistaking it for anything else. Or whether it happens that we do not remember to whom this relic once belonged. As in the case of this relic, also housed in an arm reliquary, that was carefully kept in a home shrine here in the US until it finally came into the possession of the Armenian Museum in Massachusetts. And just as we said previously, that the question of icons is not a totally Christian question, nor is it only a contemporary question for a short period of time. It is a long-lasting human question. The same thing is true about relics. The same thing is true about the physical remains of holy people or people of importance to us. Relics kind of bridged the separation between the two realities, or if you like, between the temporal and the eternal, the earthly and the heavenly realms. While that divide, that separation might seem unbreachable and opaque. In reality, the father said, it was actually more like the altar curtain that at specific times during the Eucharist or in Lent separates people from the altar. No one suspects that the altar has suddenly disappeared. We know that it's there. And what happens behind the curtain is for the sake of the people on this side of it. Likewise, the Byzantine theologians reasoned, what happens in the capital R reality is also for the sake of the people on this side of its curtain, still in reality with a small r. And so icons, in their thinking, participate in this same dynamic. The images of saints and holy events painted on a board, effectively concealed behind a curtain of pigment, the eternal reality and the grace of what was depicted. So one did not treat icons lightly. There was a protocol for making them and for using them that involved reverence for what they showed, that it involved respect for how they bridged the eternal and the temporal experience of humans. What you see in the picture here is one of the oldest icons of Mary, kept in the church in Rome that you see on the right, the Madonna of the Rosary Church. This icon shows Mary's capital R reality very clearly as she stands there in the shadowless light, her hands and her heart functioning within that light in their activities on behalf of those who stand before her. So, in a time when people were feeling that precious and empowering connection between the big and small R realities had been jeopardized, traumatized, was not functioning, it's not surprising, really, that icons became more important as a means for restoring that connection that had been severed or nearly severed by recent events. And in some cases, one can sense a kind of a desperation in the whole icon issue, a hope that somehow one could use them to pierce through that curtain entirely, and in a way to force the reality with a big R to be present, to activate in the dire circumstances of the small r reality of a shrunken Byzantine world. And so in Byzantium, in this time period, we find this conviction that there is a real presence of the holy to be accessed through an image of the holy, got carried sometimes to extremes. Icons were processed around cities in peril, or they were painted on the walls as a kind of a protective device. Icons could be used as godparents at baptisms. The Eucharist was sometimes celebrated using an icon as the Vemkar. And people swore, and I don't know that they're right or wrong, that images of saints bled and sweat and wept at the predicament in which the faithful found themselves. And of course, that's not just true in the 8th and 9th centuries. during the Second Intifada in Jerusalem in particular. Depictions of the Virgin Mary wept for the people. And according to those who saw them, it was a hugely comforting phenomenon to see. Even beyond using icons as godparents and vemkars, paint scraped from an icon and mixed with water was sometimes used for healing in the same way as holy oil. Well, for many people, this was too much. They felt that the distinction between the image and the divine reality that it portrayed was being lost. The curtain was not there anymore. And they were disturbed by the idea that they saw emerging through this, that the presence and the intervention of a saint in the desired manner could be guaranteed, in a way, forced, by possessing the image of that saint. And for many people, this is just too close to magic. What's the difference between having an icon that you believe will do what you need it to do and having a talisman of some kind? And so the Byzantine population, lay and clergy alike, was divided over icons. There were writings of the fathers in support of what came to be called the iconoclast position, the icon smashing position. For example, everyone went digging through the past to find these kinds of gems. The very revered late 2nd and early 3rd century saint and teacher Clement of Alexandria, who's showed here in the picture with a gigantic forehead to show the capacity of his mind. He had said that there are two ways of seeing Christ in the world post-incarnation. The church as a whole has a responsibility to serve as an icon of Christ. But as this little quotation here says, the individual soul, too, purified by the presence of the Holy Spirit within it, and thus beneficent in its actions, is such an image as well. One does not need, in other words, painted images. The real flesh and blood image that each of us is supposed to be should be sufficient. The Cappadocian fathers, 5th century thinkers with close ties to Armenian Christianity, as in fact had Clement, taught that God could be known only through what we don't know about him or what we know is not true about him. We know that God is not limited. We know that God is not temporal. But there's no real way to depict what is not. And so once again, there is no support in their teaching, it was felt. No reason to create icons. Also very influential was the work of a writer who is known to history as Pseudo-Dionysus, the Areopagite, which doesn't necessarily mean he didn't exist. It just means that he took the name of someone else for his writings. In this case, Dionysus, the Areopagite, was a disciple of St. Paul from an area in Athens that you can see in the right-hand picture, an outcropping of rock that stands, has a beautiful view of the Acropolis. And this rocky area is called the Areopagus. And this depiction of Pseudo-Dionysus is imaginary because we don't actually know who he was, but he was also much loved in Armenian circles. And Pseudo-Dionysus made a very elaborate and careful case for the possibility of approaching God through a gradated hierarchy of symbols, which he felt could also be the hierarchy of the church, that would allow a person finally to make the leap into contemplating God who cannot be seen, opening the way possibly through images, but more through people and structures, into a kind of mystical view of the divine. Now, you've probably noticed that I've stressed several times the connection that these particular thinkers had with Armenian spirituality, because we will see them again, and because at least indirectly and sometimes directly, Armenians had an influence on this icon controversy as it played out in Byzantium. And while we're talking about how it plays out in Byzantium this week in order to set the stage, we will talk about how it played out in Armenia next week, when we look at how this time period, and strange as it may seem, this issue caused Armenians, or gave them the opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it, to definitively reshape their Christian identity. And we're also going to discuss next week what we know about some of the anti-icon or iconoclastic groups in Armenia. So from the kind of thought end, the faith end, the speculation end of things, these are some of the things that are playing into people's minds and hearts as they begin to understand, to work with this whole question of whether icons belong in the church or whether they're extraneous or worse. The strong man who put an end to the 20 years of anarchy at the top of the Byzantine hierarchy, imperial government, was this man, Leo III. He was called Leo the Syrian because he came from what was then the province of Syria. It doesn't overlay exactly on modern Syria, on the east end of the Mediterranean. But more specifically, Leo III was from Marash. The future Emperor Leo, Conon as he was known then, came up through the ranks of the Byzantine military. Justinian II used him as an envoy to the Caucasus, to the Caucasian Albanians, and so he had experience in that very northern Armenian world. And eventually, Conon, or Leo, became commander of Anatolia, one of the provinces that was lost to the Arab invasions, and also an Armenian populated province. He married his daughter Anna to the commander of the next door province of Armenia, the Armeniac theme as it was called, a man whose name was Ardavastos. Now, it's not difficult to see in that name Ardavast. And the two men, with the support of their disillusioned military forces, staged a coup against the emperor of the day, Theodosius. And as we mentioned last time, they offered him the chance to save his life and his son's life, abdicate and become a monk, and he took them up on it. And so it was a bloodless coup. And from this point onward, from Leo's sitting on the throne onward through several generations, so a century more or less, emperors are going to take active positions, even though they're not theologians, either in support of or against icons, alternately banning them from use and endorsing them. But before we go there, there is another factor to consider in the question of icons. Are they right or are they wrong? Because this is not just a theological issue. This is not just an issue of faith and understanding. Emperors are not normally theologians, and yet they are important actors in the question because emperors were the vicars of God to head the Christian empire. And the ultimate proof that an emperor's policies were pleasing to God or not was the success God gave him or her in this period, so we'll see, in military matters, or the defeats that the emperor suffered. So in a kind of simple-minded fashion, and it is something that I'm sure we all share to a degree, the idea that God blesses with success in terms that we can understand success, like military victory and so on. The things that God blesses with that kind of success are pleasing to him. The things that he does not bless with that kind of success are not pleasing to him. So we hope we're beyond that, but in this time period, it's definitely still very much a part of people's psyche. And so when Leo III was successful, just a few months after he first sat on the throne, successful in defeating an Arab army that attacked Constantinople, he had a kind of a mandate for his policies. And as was not unusual for military men who served in the East, in Anatolia, in Armenia, in Syria, he was not a lover of icons. And he realized the importance as emperor of unifying his territories, such as they remained, around faith. And so he issued an edict to baptize all the Jews and the non-mainstream believers in his territories. He also prohibited the use of icons. Now, it was a very divisive decision. The Patriarch of Constantinople resigned over this. The Italian territories that still belonged to Byzantium rebelled over this. Monasteries and theologians in general refused to support or abide by this edict. On the other hand, the military and the bureaucracy were pleased, each for their own reasons. But other people saw no difference between the emperor's edict to destroy images and the same kind of issue that, or the same kind of edict that had been issued just a few years before by the Caliph Yazid II. So there was uncertainty. Why is he banning the images? Is it because of Islamic influence? Is it because of faith? What is it? Well, according to an alternate story about Leo's decision to officially ban icons, he was prompted to take this step also by a clear portent in nature. I don't know if any of you have been here, but this is the idyllic island of Santorini, famous today as a vacation spot with gorgeous sunsets, beautiful views of smaller islands that it shares the group called the Cyclades Islands. But when you look at it from the air, you begin to see that there's a strange kind of relationship between the big island of Santorini and the islands that are within its bay. And you discover that in actuality, the islands are the upper bits of a volcano, an active volcano. And what looks like a placid bay is actually the caldera of the volcano. There you can see it clearly. The two kind of shadowy islands in the middle of the volcano's crater. and Santorini around the edge. So anyway, according to this theory of why Leo became so strongly iconoclastic, not just in his opinions, but in his policies, was that a devastating eruption spewed ash hundreds of meters into the air, caused incredible damage, and was viewed by him as a warning, a divine sign that yes, he was militarily successful to begin with. God granted him that. But he needed also to attend to the agenda of the capital F force that could move forces of nature in this way. So whether that's truly part of his motivation or not, Leo did take a strong stand against icons, despite the considerable opposition to his ideas. And when he died in his early 50s, he was succeeded by his very capable son, Constantine V, who is shown here, together with his son, Leo IV. Leo had begun to reign officially together with his father, Constantine, at the age of 2. Not that he could actually reign, but it was a way of trying to keep the succession clear and peaceful. So Constantine followed in his father's footsteps as a militarily very successful emperor. And he also carried on his father's stance regarding icons. Here you see a manuscript illumination of him ordering the destruction of some icons. And Constantine convened a council to support his stronger stance on icons. Now, when he died in 775, Constantine was very popular with both the military and the people, not necessarily with monks and theologians. And so, I probably shouldn't tell you the story, but anyway, his enemies took very unfair advantage of a little incident that had happened during his baptism as an infant. You know, these things happen. They're infants. What are you going to do? Little Constantine, we're told, pooped in the water of the baptismal font. Or maybe other people say it was in the royal purple wraps that they put on him afterwards. But you know how these things go. You never get to live this kind of a thing down. And so the pro-icon folks who didn't like him said it was clear from the very beginning that this guy was going to be Constantine the Shitty. And in fact, even till today, he's often called Constantine Copronymus, Constantine the Shitty. Anyway, it's all a matter of opinion. Beloved by some, not by others. Constantine's son, Leo IV, who we saw on the coin with him, was a sickly young guy who died at the age of 30 from tuberculosis. He was an iconoclast like his father had been and his grandfather. But somehow it looked like there was no mandate from God for him to carry on those iconoclastic opinions. He did not have the military success or the lifespan of his predecessors. Leo's young widow, Irene, who was every bit as formidable as she looks in this picture, was not on board with her husband's anti-icon stance. Now, as you can see from her dates, Irene had a long run in power from 780 to 802. The first part of that she spent as regent for her son, And as we shall see in a moment, the reason why she spent the last 5 years as sole ruler of the empire had something to do with icons. When she became regent for her young son, with whom she's shown here on a coin, she reversed her husband's policy on icons. Icons came back into favor. She held a second council at Nicaea, this is a picture of the city walls, in order to make that decision stick. There was great rejoicing amongst all the people who had disliked the policies of Leo, Constantine, and Leo. They felt vindicated in their defense of icons. And then the very resilient and politically astute Irene suffered military defeats and died in exile, leaving people to take the lesson, perhaps, that although an iconoclastic man like her husband had died young, and it seemed that God did not approve of his ways, neither did God seem to approve of hers. But you have to wonder, was it that God didn't care for her pro-icon stance? Or was it because when her son showed signs of independence from her and wanted her to step aside, instead of stepping aside, she had her son's eyes gouged out so that she could rule alone? That could have been it. But in either case, it seems clear that God did not favor those who supported icons like Irene or those who opposed them, like her short-lived husband, Leo. And the first iconoclastic controversy was over. It ended with the council at Nicaea. Now we say the first round, because yes, indeed, there will be a second, and we'll talk about that later, where again, people who were pro and against icons would defend their positions in front of the emperor, as they are doing in this depiction. But we're going to jump ahead for just a second. Give you a little spoiler alert here. By the days of the Empress Theodora in the middle of the 9th century, like Irene, she took advantage of her iconoclast husband's death to, it's a great story, to reinstate icons as part of worship once and for all. And just by the way, she was Armenian. By this point, by the time you get to Theodora, people really had concluded that the faithful's attitude toward icons really makes no political difference at all. It's a theological matter. And yes, we want to be careful in how we use them. We don't want to turn them into idols. We don't want to over-venerate them, but there is a very good case to be made for them. And part of the case that could be made for them by that point was that by accepting and using icons, Christian Byzantines differentiated themselves from their Muslim and Jewish peers who did not want anything to do with images. And it was good to be distinguished from one's Muslim and Jewish peers, because in Byzantine eyes, the ideas of those peoples concerning God and the image of God were obviously underdeveloped. So after a long, hard, and bloody century, the icon question will finally resolve itself in Byzantium, with the final solution being moderate reverence for icons, careful use of them. And there are still signs of this long episode in Christian history. It's kind of ironic. It might be a little hard to see this, actually. It's ironic that the Church of Saint Irene, for whom that icon-loving empress was named, still has in its apse not the usual depiction of Christ, but only a very simple schematic cross. So in Armenia, as we will see next week, the whole icon business is much less traumatic. Partly because Armenians, never having ruled the known world as an empire that felt especially that its rulers were appointed by God, Armenians didn't have that experience, and so they didn't go through that same bitter process of soul searching that the Byzantines did when the Muslim takeover of their territory happened. By that time, Armenians already had a couple hundred years of experience in living under someone else's government, and how to get along and what to do. So what we see next time will be the same issue in a quite different guise. And in case you would like to see a summary of this whole hour done in just under 3 minutes, try accessing this little video on YouTube. I found it this afternoon and I was thinking, well, I have just made myself redundant, but it's quite well done. What it lacks in detail, because obviously it's only 3 minutes, not even quite. What it lacks in detail, it makes up for in entertainment, and I think you will enjoy it. Actually, I did. So I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week for a session that will be entitled Redefining Armenian Identity.